Well, the good news in Washington, D.C. really is that there is, where I generally hang out, is that there really is a sea change in that city. And to put it in some kind of perspective, though, and to show you how erudite I am about matters biblical, I will say, though, sea change, yes, but it's not a parting of the Red Sea yet. And that bad guys are still coming after us from the other side. Obviously, it's better to have a president in office who has actually taught constitutional law, replacing a gentleman in office who apparently had never read the Constitution at all, which is kind of what our last president did, or didn't do. And you know, you've got to be gratified. You have to be gratified that any president would have an inaugural committee that would not only invite Pete Seeger to sing at a concert, but then allow him to sing "In This Land Is Your Land," the greatest verse of all of them, the one that you never hear. I went out walking, I saw a sign there, and the sign said private property. But on the other side, it didn't say nothing. And that side is made for you and me. That's been taken out of school books and song books for 35 years. It was kind of great to see it there. A couple of things have happened to me since I was here a couple of years ago. First one involves a woman named Ann Coulter. Do you know her? Yeah, Ann Coulter. What a great woman. She rewrites the same book every year, and then it always gets on the New York Times bestseller list because so many of these conservative groups buy it in bulk, thousands and thousands of copies of it, and then for the first couple weeks after it's published, she lives on cable television. In fact, she's the only author you see. You'd think nobody had written any books except perhaps Shakespeare and Ann Coulter. Anyway, upon the death of the Reverend Jerry Falwell in April of 2007, Miss Coulter wrote an obituary. And in the obituary she said, "I always agreed with Dr. Falwell, except," she said, quoting her, "there was one small item I think Falwell got wrong. He said, as you may remember, that God lifted his curtain of protection on America on September the 11th because of gay people and feminists and the ACLU. She said Dr. Falwell had gotten that wrong because he failed to specifically mention Ted Kennedy and Barry Lynn, blaming me." So that was kind of I put that in my resume now. Then during that recent presidential election, remember the one that went on for the last 17 years, we at Americans United do believe that if you're a church or a synagogue or temple, you got to play by the same rules every other nonprofit does. That means you can't use your resources to endorse or oppose candidates for public office. And when we found people who did it, this year surprisingly a lot more on the right than you could imagine, we report that to the Internal Revenue Service. We say you ought to investigate this. Well, my favorite report that we did this year was for a gentleman named Wiley Drake, which I realize sounds like the name of a cartoon character, but in fact, it's a name of a Southern Baptist minister out in Orange County, California. And we had learned that he had endorsed Mike Huckabee, former governor of Arkansas, to be the nominee for the Republican Party. He did it on his church letterhead. He did it on his little radio show he does every day out of the basement of his church. We felt that this violated the prohibition against endorsing candidates with church money. So he sent a note to the IRS, and because I am a kind and wonderful person, I sent a copy of the complaint to Reverend Drake so he'd know what we had done. He didn't take too kindly to that. He immediately issued a press release, sent it out to the New York Times and to CNN, labeling me and all of my communications staff as God's enemies. He had a little spelling problem, meant enemies. And he said that what was started was a campaign of imprecatory prayer against me. Now, imprecatory prayers, for those of you who don't know, and he thought a lot of people wouldn't know, so he included in his press release a section called How to Pray Imprecatory Prayers. And they're basically prayers that call on people to die, prayed for death. The one that he wanted prayed about me was the following: pray that my children be fatherless and my wife a widow, that my children be continually vagabonds and beg, let them seek bread out of desolate places. Now see, that was not too kind. But he was mad, I understand that. But apparently he didn't know much about my children because he kind of got that wrong. See, my son works at Google, and my daughter is graduating from the University of Virginia Law School. She's going to work for one of the most prestigious law firms in the country starting next fall. And I think the only bread they're likely to be scavenging perhaps are baguettes in the dark corners of fancy French restaurants that you and I can't afford to go to. We'll talk plenty about what's actually going on in Washington and around the country. But just for those of you who haven't heard me before, I did want to give you a sense of where I thought we started on the church-state separation matter and why in the world people want to change it, still want to change it, still want to mess with it. To me, the separation of church and state is literally the greatest intellectual idea, construct that this country has given to the rest of the world. It's the best. You know, comparatively speaking, we've had very little religious strife in this country. That doesn't mean you'd be Pollyannish about it and say nothing bad ever happened. We know that it did. My own theological antecedents now in what we call the United Church of Christ, but were frankly the people who ran the Salem witch trials back in 1692. So I know we have some problems. In Philadelphia, north of Philadelphia, right before the Civil War, churches were burned, people were murdered, literally murdered, over whether the Protestant or the Catholic version of the Bible should be read in Pennsylvania's public schools. So we haven't gotten everything right. In the Second World War, there's no question that anti-Semitism played a role in the immigration policies of the United States. And coming closer to home, September 11th, after September 11th, there were people killed just for being like Muslims. There was a man killed, for example, a gas station attendant who was a Sikh, had a Sikh headdress on, head covering on. Somebody thought he was a Muslim and just shot him. So there's good and bad and ugly in this religious freedom and diversity that we celebrate, but we've mainly gotten it right, and we've gotten it a lot more right than most places throughout the United States. So with those footnotes, we still have a great thing going. Just keeping a decent distance between the institutions of government and religion is really what religious freedom and the separation of church and state is all about. When this country designed that concept over 200 years ago, it broke with 14 centuries of direct ecclesiastical rule in the Western world. Our founders believed to the contrary, that religions or religion would fail or succeed on the basis of the power of its ideas, not on the power of the sword or the power of the purse that was given to it by governments, that we were going to maintain a strict separation in the fulfillment of individual freedom and intellectual responsibility. And they were right then and they're right today. Our Constitution's authors knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't make general statements unless they meant them. Many of the same men who drafted the Constitution were the people who, of course, specifically in the very first amendment to the Bill of Rights said, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's very grandiose. It was designed that way to make sure that it would be a meaningful statement on for the centuries. It reflected very, very clearly what George Washington said when he visited the first synagogue set up in the United States, the Truro Synagogue up in Rhode Island. Washington had been asked by the head of the synagogue to explain what this new country was going to do about religious minorities. And he said, the citizens of the United States have a right to applaud themselves because it is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another could exercise their inherent national gifts. The President said, happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that citizens be good in this country. And with that, Washington really distinguished himself from all these ideas that we would tolerate people who didn't have the same religious ideas we did, or we'd tolerate the non-believer because we were all equal. That's the essential strength of the whole constitutional construct. Washington wasn't a terribly religious guy. He generally took Martha Washington to church. You know, they would ride in the carriage. She would go in and listen to the sermons. He would stand outside and smoke. Now, when you think about it, maybe he just didn't have somebody like Reverend Jeremiah Wright preaching, because that might have awakened his interest. I don't know. Jefferson, James Madison, the other great architect of these ideas of religious freedom, really meant what they said. Jefferson, remember, refused to issue any proclamations of days of prayer or thanksgiving under the shocking thesis that it was up to churches to decide when you should pray, not up to the federal government to do so. It was extraordinary too. James Madison argued on the floor of the House of Representatives in 1790 that the census form should not even be permitted to count the number of clergy in the country. He said it was too intrusive, none of the government's business. Speaking of being intrusive, now if you get the long form, of course, for the census, you don't have to worry just about being counted as a professional, you have to worry about counting indoor toilets. So he called this an indelicacy. Little did he know. A lot of supporters of church-state separation hundreds of years ago felt the same kind of criticisms that we feel and that I get regularly from people like Lou Dobbs and Bill O'Reilly. They were just as adamant then that if the government didn't support religion, that religion would fail. And it's out of that narrow, losing side of the argument over 200 years ago that the so-called religious right gains its inspiration today. It remains an inspiration that's completely inconsistent with what the Constitution is all about. That's the predicate. That's kind of my feelings about history. That's why so many people have so much hope about what the Constitution properly understood would do. I think in spite of the fact that most of us here, I'm making an assumption here, were pretty happy the day of the last election. There were a couple of hiccups in the first weeks after President-elect Obama was working on his inauguration. Some of us were kind of confused and disturbed that he chose Pastor Rick Warren, the author of The Purpose-Driven Life, to give the first prayer at the inauguration ceremony, the official inauguration ceremony. A lot of us don't think, frankly, there ought to be prayers at inaugurations because inaugurations are secular events. They're not religious ones. They shouldn't be turned into them. And Pastor Rick Warren was an odd choice because he had supported the notorious Proposition 8, similar to your Proposition 2 here in Florida, that one invalidated a Supreme Court decision by the state of California saying that if you have same-sex couples, they're entitled to the same rights under civil law as people of opposite genders. This was the decision of the court overturned by Proposition 8 out there, and overturned with the help of Rick Warren, a man who actually compared being gay in America to being a practitioner of bestiality or incest. Now, why would this guy be invited to participate in Barack Obama's inauguration? The argument from his staff was he was just trying to do outreach to a large number of Americans. And I'm trying to figure out what segment that was. People who have bigoted ideas about gay people, or people who didn't vote for Barack Obama in the first place and are never going to in the future. I don't know why he did it, but that was very exclusionary. And then, of course, Rick Warren did kind of confirm this. He was so Christocentric that he prayed to Jesus in the prayer in 4 different languages. And then in case you didn't get the point that he was promoting Christianity, he appended the Lord's Prayer to his own prayer, making the prayer almost as long as Barack Obama's speech that day. We got it. The administration did get down to work there. Stimulus package, remember that? We haven't seen the money yet, but it's coming. The stimulus package was put on the table right away. Originally, the package contained hundreds of millions of dollars for contraceptive assistance to poor women. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who I think many of us respect a great deal, discussed it openly on one of the Sunday morning talk shows. And within 24 hours, the right-wingers in this country had taken up arms, labeling this money for contraception to be close to genocide. Close to genocide. They used their time-honored mix and their big noise machine of talk radio and right-wing blogs on the internet, and of course, the ever-popular Fox News channel, to say that this was going to kill black babies and that that was the intent of the Speaker and the President. Unfortunately, about 24 hours after her appearance, President Obama reportedly called personally the chairman of the committee that's responsible for this part of the stimulus, Henry Waxman of California, and said, "Henry, take this out of the bill. Take it away." And it was removed. As you remember, the stimulus package did get through the Congress, but not with one vote from any Republican. All the people that were complaining about that provision in the bill. I mention this because I don't think these things are just about symbolism. I do want to think that this president is going to make sure that that money gets to women who need it sometime in the future. But the truth is that all the research has already been done, and we know what it says. Your economic well-being is severely impacted if you have an early unplanned pregnancy. Researchers found a few years ago that a tiny little change in Medicaid eligibility that allowed some small group, relatively small group of poor women to obtain contraceptives free, reduced unwanted pregnancies in teenagers by 4%, a tiny little regulatory change. And I think we understand that plenty of other research that contraceptives lead to increased access to higher education, increased access to better paying jobs and more robust long-term earnings. That's not genocide, it's called economics. And people understand it, and people who have the money make those choices today. That funding could have done that, but in the name of some non-existent compromise, it was eliminated. One of the things that action by the so-called religious right should demonstrate to people is that the religious right has not gone away. It has not disappeared. They were over that issue like flies over a garbage dump. They continue to do it. The communication strategy, they take no enemies. They're out with destruction on television, radio, and on the blogs. Majority party apparently still gets as scared as when they were the minority party, worried that if they do anything to upset the 18 to 21% of Americans that characterize themselves as members of the religious right, they'll take action against them in the next election cycle. These guys are worried about it 3 weeks after they just took office, and they're worried about the next election cycle. We have to be the people, by calling and writing, that say, we want to hold you to a standard of difference, of change, of the very things that we elected you to do. This was, I hope, also a wake-up call for all the pundits, the TV guys and the newspaper editors, who said, that religious right, it's dead. It's dead. Quite to the contrary, it was quite alive, and in fact, you saw a lot of it during the campaign. Remember during the campaign how John McCain, who the religious right never liked to begin with, they said, you'd better pick somebody that's really a conservative, and of course he did, Sarah Palin, who turned out, of course, to be challenged geographically, literarily, couldn't remember a single newspaper in the country, and a couple of other ways. But they were working hard to make sure that happened as a signal that they had power. And they did get reelected, a lot of their favorite members of the United States Senate, which means, the other party didn't quite get to that 60 number, no matter what happens to my friend Al Franken. You'd think also if a movement were on its deathbed, which some people had declared during the campaign, erroneously declared, their money would be drying up. Let me give you a couple of raw numbers to demonstrate that maybe that wasn't so. We do a survey every couple of years. We look at tax records publicly available, see how much money the religious right's making. As we know how much we're making, we look there and we see they're making a little bit more. Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting in the last reporting cycle raised $247 million. $50 million more than the year before. Not exactly death throes. Brother Robertson, by the way, still gets money from the federal government, believe it or not, even with that kind of money in his own bank account. Focus on the Family, that's run by James Dobson out in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He got a paltry $157 million that year. So he's got a little catching up to do. They don't always spend it on hot button issues, but they usually do. I have a new blog on BeliefNet.com, if some of you look at that. It's a blog where I have an argument about church and state and culture with Jay Sekulow, a former head of Jews for Jesus who became a member of the Pat Robertson Empire, became a convert to born-again Christianity. He has something called the American Center for Law and Justice. It primarily litigates and helped the last president select all those wonderful judges that the Bush administration picked. His last IRS report, $42 million and change. $42 million. It's a group you probably never even heard of, the Alliance Defense Fund out in Arizona, took in $31.5 million. Its director is a man named Alan Sears, who wrote a book recently in which he said that Hollywood was largely responsible for the corruption of this generation of Americans, actually saying that the movie Some Like It Hot, remember that? Yeah, it's a pretty good movie. Yeah, it was a secret movie, though. You probably didn't get this, but he said Some Like It Hot was responsible for the increased acceptance of cross-dressing in America today. That movie. It's a great guy, really. How about the American Family Association? That's run by a guy you see occasionally on TV. Don Wildman is his name. He lives in Tupelo, Mississippi. His two most recent campaigns, the first one was against McDonald's. He was urging people not to eat at McDonald's, not because, of course, it's unhealthy to eat at McDonald's, but hold your ears, I don't want anybody fainting, but the McDonald's Corporation had joined the Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce. He found that so shocking, he said, don't eat at McDonald's. You know what? McDonald's gave in. They quit. They quit. Power of a guy you may never have heard of in Tupelo, Mississippi. Oh, now his new campaign against Hallmark greeting cards. Now what in the world could he be along with a Hallmark greeting card? Anybody want to take a guess? Let's see, wedding cards for same-sex couples. They have a line, a very small line, but a line of those. He wants you to boycott Hallmark because of it. Hallmark hasn't given in yet. They have all this money, they have all this power, and since the election they've gotten more money. When I talk to these guys on the phone or I talk to them on radio or television, they go, oh yeah, we got mail bags of money in. Mail bags of money, because they have to fight against, you know, the coming fascist state that they all think is going to happen probably in the next 10 or 15 days. Two of the great leaders of the religious right have passed away, died. Since I was here, Jerry Falwell, of course, and D. James Kennedy, who was a very powerful TV preacher over in Fort Lauderdale, where I landed yesterday. And I thought, gee, with people like Kennedy and Falwell gone, there won't be people saying all these wacky things that I can report to people like you and get a cheap laugh out of it. I should not have worried, because there's so many new guys on the horizon, almost all guys on the horizon, that you can hardly believe it. Take Rod Parsley, ever hear of him? He has a little church in Ohio, 12,000 member church. He briefly was a bigwig in the John McCain campaign, but then people started to actually read what the guy said. And he wrote a book, for example, in 2005 called Silent No More. In it he describes why the United States was set up. A little different than perhaps what I just said. He said, I cannot tell you how important it is that we understand the true nature of this country and the true nature of Islam. The fact is that America was founded in part with the intention of seeing this false religion destroyed. What? I didn't see that in any books. I went to college. I have 2 graduate degrees. I never saw that. And in fact, it kind of runs counter to the very words that the 5th Congress approved in the Treaty of Tripoli with some of these Islamic states that declared this was in no way founded as a Christian nation. That's written in Arabic and in English. Kind of counter to that, but he said it. And then Mike Huckabee, I mentioned him. Mike Huckabee is a very charming fellow. He now has a show on Fox News Channel. Where it's not a surprise to this gentleman, not a surprise to me, because I think he does want to be the next Republican nominee, and this is a good way to get a little bit of attention. You may remember that of the many strange and bizarre things he said when he was running in the last time. He said the following. This is about 2 weeks before he left the campaign. He won 7 states, by the way, 7 caucuses and primaries, Governor Mike Huckabee. So here's what he said. I have opponents in this race who do not want to change the Constitution. But I believe it's a lot easier to change the Constitution than it would be to change the Word of the living God. And that's what we need to do, is amend the Constitution so it's in God's standards, rather than trying to change God's standards to line up with some contemporary view of how we treat each other. That's astonishing. A man to say that we have to change the Constitution to reflect his narrow religious views. And it goes on and on. James Dobson, the guy from Focus on the Family, attacked Barack Obama during the campaign for holding, quote, a fruitcake interpretation of the Constitution. A fruitcake interpretation, what could that have been about? Well, Barack Obama back in 2006 was giving a speech to kind of moderate evangelical Christians, and he just said the laws of the country have to have a secular basis. He said, you know, you can be against abortion because you think that's what the Bible says, but you can't expect politicians to pass laws based on the Bible. That's all he said. That became, in Dobson's view, a fruitcake interpretation. If I had gotten any fruitcake this last December, and thank God I didn't, but I would have sent it on to James Dobson and said, this really is a fruitcake. Power of religious evangelicals became apparent in a number of other ways this month. Sadly, they're already having an effect on one promise that Barack Obama made, and I want to talk about that just a little bit. Remember the faith-based initiative? That was probably been put in place the last time I was down here by President Bush. It was set up by President Bush. I sometimes forget President Bush's name. I'm sorry about that. But for the last 6 months, actually, in Washington, everybody forgot his name. You can notice nobody wanted him to run with them. Nobody wanted him to do anything. But he's the guy who set up the office. During that campaign, then candidate Barack Obama told an audience in Zanesville, Ohio, I'm going to keep some partnership between religious groups that serve the poor and government. And that distressed some people because we'd like the separation to be even purer than that. But he said the following, now make no mistake, first, if you get a federal grant, you can't use that money to proselytize to the people you help. And you can't discriminate against them or against the people you hire on the basis of their religion. Second, federal dollars that go to churches, mosques, or temples can only be used for secular purposes that actually work. Then issued an even more detailed statement where he said, you get a government dollar, you cannot discriminate. In fact, said there is no discriminating with tax dollars, period. That's pretty clear. Well, within a couple days of the election, we started to hear rumors about his new faith-based office. It was going to be run by a 26-year-old Pentecostal minister named Joshua Dubois. He's only 26, but you know, a lot of us thought we were kind of smart asses at 26, so that's not a disqualification. But it was kind of odd, particularly after the Pentecostal church said they weren't sure that they actually ever ordained anybody with that name. But leave that aside. Thursday, February 5th, the President goes to the National Prayer Breakfast, says that he'll be signing an executive order later that day revising the President Bush faith-based office, and he did that. But for a variety of reasons, he didn't do a very good job of changing the President's office. And one of the things you might do after the first card goes about Afghanistan, 17,000 more Americans would be sent to Afghanistan in a country that barely exists in a war that we shouldn't be fighting, but I'm really not here to talk about that. Next one you might want to write about is this faith-based office. Remember, he said he'd correct the problem. You couldn't discriminate in hiring. But he left every one of the Bush executive orders about this subject in place, including one from 2002, which unequivocally allows any religious group that gets your tax money to literally take out an ad that says, job opening, but no Jews or atheists need apply. I mean, that's literally what he has left in place as the guidance for Mr. Dubois and his new faith-based office. They can refuse to hire you if you're a religious organization. You get the government's money, which would be our money in a very real way, if you had an abortion. They can ask if you said, I had one. They said, we're not hiring you. How about if you're gay or lesbian? We're not hiring you. How about if you won't sign a pledge that you believe in the inerrancy of the Christian Bible? If you don't sign it, you don't get a job. With your money. We represent this a lesbian child care worker down in Kentucky. You might have heard her on NPR. She and I were on something a couple of weeks ago. And she said the irony is, it's my money. I got a job. I'm paying into the tax system. But if I want a job, I can't get it because of my sexual orientation and the fact that the churches down here won't hire me because of that orientation. They won't hire me even though it's my money. That's unfortunately the same rubric this new president of ours is operating under. We've got to get him to change this, and we can get him to change it. And we just initiated a big letter writing campaign 3 days ago. If you're on the internet and you go to www.au.org, Americans United's website, you can get even more detailed information. And it's important that we do this. The stimulus package contains tens of billions of dollars that are going to departments of the federal government that have these discriminatory hiring rules. And the money can be, if it was issued tomorrow, it would be issued under the same rubric that I've just discussed. And I think we simply cannot allow that to happen. He also set up in the White House a group of people, advisors, to work on this issue, and they're kind of a strange group, kind of an eclectic mix. Some of the people are people I've known and are pretty decent people, very decent people, but then there's some real strange birds, like the former president of the Southern Baptist Convention, Frank Page. Frank Page is one of the guys who got through the Southern Baptist Convention's last annual meeting, that resolution that said that that wives must, quote, obey their husbands. And of course he's anti-reproductive choice, and he's anti-gay rights, he's anti-everything else, but he's even that far. And then even people like Jim Wallace, who you see on TV every once in a while. Jim Wallace is promoted as a moderate, progressive evangelical, and he is against the war in Iraq, that's good. And he's against poverty, that's good, but he's also against women's reproductive rights. He pickets outside of women's health clinics. He's against same-sex marriage. He's against the separation of church and state. So he's got a couple of negatives. But these are the kind of people. But when you think about it, setting up a council in the White House of 25 people, most of whom are religious, is a little odd in a secular government, isn't it? I mean, we don't have a college of cardinals in the United States. So I'm thinking maybe you want to put a footnote saying you're a little uncomfortable with this idea of having this kind of group of religious people making policy recommendations in a secular democracy, because we've never had it before. The evangelical Christian community, which is not all complete right-wingers, there are some people who are more moderate, and some of what is happening, and some of the reason that these decisions that make us uncomfortable are happening is because Barack Obama says, well, you know, statistically 2% more evangelical Christians voted for me than voted for John Kerry. And although that's technically true, 2% of everybody more voted for this Barack Obama candidacy than John Kerry's. That's why we call Mr. Obama president, and John Kerry we still call senator. If you wanted to find left-handed people who are under 5'5" tall, they voted 2% more for Barack Obama. So it's not that religious people do not deserve special privilege or special treatment in the Barack Obama administration. So those are some of the troubling things Again, in a rubric of change and at a time when we do want to believe that big changes can come. Even progressive politicians need to be reminded that it is progressive people and their ideas that took presidents even to this White House, and that we have to hold them accountable for the promises they made and the Constitution they swore to uphold. Absolutely. These issues, thank you. And we're worried also, because I know there's some local issues some of you want to talk about, and that's great, and we'll do that. All over the country, when the religious right doesn't get quite the access that it had to the White House in the Bush years, they come knocking on doors like the legislative doors here in Florida and in Alabama. And I'm going over to Louisiana where they just about broke down the doors. Bobby Jindal, the governor over there, is, yeah, that's exactly my reaction. Yeah, you can't believe what he does. Anyway, I'm going over there to try to save Louisiana in a couple of days. We got about 9 chapters of Americans United here in Florida. There's an absolute flood of bad ideas in this state and around the country. You know what happened in the last election cycle. You had on the ballot that anti-same-sex marriage amendment, which passed. I really thought we could all defeat that, but we didn't. What you may also know, you almost had 2 other amendments on the ballot that would have been very bad. There's that little commission that meets down here every 20 years, the Florida Tax and Budget Reform Commission. Most people never heard of it. Most of the people on it never heard of it. Until 20 years comes by, and then they go, man, 20 years, we'll get to do something finally. Let's do something like amend the Constitution. And they proposed 2 amendments for the Constitution of Florida. The first one would have eliminated from your Constitution the existing prohibition against giving money out of your state treasury to religious ministries, churches, and other operations. Would have just eliminated the provision and replaced it with one to the contrary. The Second Amendment that you didn't see, I'll tell you why, you didn't see it, would have allowed for school vouchers for private religious schools, taking your already underfunded, I think you're about the 48th funded school system in the country, take money away from it and merge it into private religious schools. The reason those amendments did not appear is that a few organizations with a lot of people and members down here in Florida, we sued the commission, arguing that they did not have the power to make these constitutional changes. A rabbi who's on the Americans United Board of Directors over in Orlando, I'm going to see him in a few days, he was one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit challenging those, and they were knocked off the ballot. That's the good news, because you didn't have to deal with them. But the bad news is, in the same way that good amendments can be put on your ballot, as we just heard a few minutes ago, bad ones can too, and there are already people thinking about how to circulate petitions to get those revocations. The very idea of public schools, they're secular, and the very idea that you have a separation of church and state in your Florida Constitution, to have those provisions removed. So they're very, very dangerous. You're going to see in this state more and more voucher plans. We keep knocking them out in court, but they keep coming back with a variety of leadership in your governor's office. We're going to see all kinds of other innovative tuition tax credit schemes, which if you're interested we can talk about after the break. And you're also going to see persistent efforts here, as they have already in Louisiana, to find new and innovative ways to make sure that your children and your grandchildren, if they're in Florida schools, are scientifically illiterate, because they're going to go and fight evolution. You know, we, along with the ACLU of Pennsylvania, stopped in so-called teaching of intelligent design in the Dover, Pennsylvania schools a couple of years ago. We independently fought a similar effort in the mountains in Northern California a couple of years after that. We've been trying to put out fires all over the place. But there are a lot of renewed efforts, clever new efforts, to find ways to sneak creation science, pseudoscience, into the school systems of Florida and many, many states around the country. It's only a hair's breadth away. They never say it's religion they're trying to bring into the classroom. They always say it's just science. A guy, believe it or not, sent me a 300-page book recently to prove scientifically that the heliocentric universe is a lie. The scientists got that. Heliocentric, the sun is in the center, of our solar system, like the Earth revolves around the sun. He said, no, the sun revolves around the Earth. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because if you're a literalist, if you're a Bible fundamentalist, in order for Joshua to have had God stop the sun in order to defeat the 3 kings at Gibeon, it has to be that we're in the center of the solar system, if not the entire universe. So he had to write a book to prove it. I'm just worried that sometime, probably in Louisiana, they're going to say not only do we allow people to use phony pseudo-scientific ideas to debunk evolution, but we'll be having them say, well, some people believe the Earth goes around the sun, some people believe the sun goes around the Earth. You decide. You decide. So these things are out there, and they're all at the state level, at the local level, at the national level, starting to raise questions about the fundamental viability of a doctrine that has worked so well in this country, that has managed to find a way for 2,000 different religions and 20 million non-believers and free thinkers and humanists to get along reasonably well together in this country. Why would we want to change it? Only because there are people who have such an abiding disrespect for the Constitution and an assurance that their religious beliefs are right, that they want the power to tell your children, your grandchildren, and yes, even yourself, literally how to live your life from the moment of conception until the moment of death, which they will define, and pretty much every moment in between. That's the struggle we're in. That's the war we didn't start. It's a cultural war, as Pat Buchanan, my old radio partner, used to say, a cultural war for the soul of America. We didn't start it, and whether you believe in souls or not, we do have to win it. When we come back after taking this little break, we'll talk about some of the things on your mind, because groups like this are the people who have kept the wolf away from the door, who have kept the Constitution secure, and you're still, I'll bet, willing to do some more to make sure we save it. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Has the IRS responded and begun proceedings against the offending churches?
All right, the question is, has the IRS begun proceedings against the offending churches? We reported about 18 churches that had supported a variety of candidates. This year, because of something I'll just briefly mention, most of them were pretty far right churches, not surprisingly all supporting the candidacy of John McCain and Sarah Palin. We don't have, let me just grab something here. It's clear-colored bourbon. Fools even Baptists. No, I'm kidding. The TV people will go. The Internal Revenue Service system says if you're a nonprofit, you want to take positions on issues, that's fine. What you just saw, the gentleman who took off his hat and he said, this really is nonpartisan about redistricting here. You can do that as a nonprofit organization. The Birdwatching Society can say, we want to save more wetlands so that there are more birds. That's not a problem. And churches can do the same thing. They can take positions, and they do. I'm going to be at a church tomorrow over in Clearwater. That's why it's so progressive. It's going to look like you. I mean, it's a real progressive church, and they're going to be talking about Afghanistan, and they're going to be talking about all the right issues. I know that. But you can't cross one line if you're a nonprofit. You can't endorse or oppose candidates for public office. If you do, you lose your tax exemption. We got involved in trying to fight against this illegal campaigning back in the beginning of my tenure at Americans United about 18 years ago. Clinton was running for his first time, and a little church, little tiny church, had about 18 members. They raised $44,000. Imagine that. I don't know how. To take out a full-page ad in USA Today, said don't vote for Bill Clinton because he's a sinner. And it got a lot of, they didn't even know. That was the beginning. No, yes, see, this is what I, this is what I do when they invite me to comedy club. And they had all these Bible passages. He believes this, that's wrong. And then they said, if you vote for a sinner, you're a sinner too. There was a Bible passage to prove that. And they raised, they raised money, and they used it to try to defeat Clinton in his first term. We reported that to the Internal Revenue Service. We said this was obviously crossing the line. It was opposition to a candidate for public office. That church lost its tax exemption, never got back. The church actually went out of business. They had to reformulate and set themselves up in other ways. We do know, for example, that one of the places we complained about here in Florida, Bill Keller Ministries. You ever hear of this guy? He apparently used to have a local television show. And he claims that 2.4 million people look at his website. And one day on his website, he put up during the Republican primaries a note that said, do not vote for Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney is a Mormon, and a vote for Mitt Romney is a vote for Satan. Whoa, we thought that kind of went over the line a little bit. So we reported him to the IRS, and I just got a call from the St. Petersburg paper last week that's saying that they have heard that he is under investigation and they don't know what will happen. And we don't have any special moles in the IRS, so we don't have any secret information. But this IRS has taken this very seriously. We do know of other accounts where they have gone in, they have made challenges. Some cases that we think they should have pursued more vigorously, we know they have dropped. But it is important that we keep everybody on that level playing field. Our little project called Project Fair Play. What's fair for one charity or one group is fair for the others. And you can't allow churches to start endorsing candidates and still maintain their tax exemption. If they want to endorse candidates, become a political action committee, change your tax status, that's fine, but you can't have it both ways, and the IRS finally, after years of, shall we say, slowness, seems to be cracking down in this election cycle. We'll know a lot more in 6 months.
Can we make a case for defunding the military?
All right, can I translate?
Yes.
This is a good question. The question is based on withholding funds for entities that discriminate. Can we make a case for defunding the military? And there's actually a couple of interesting things. Sadly, the bottom line answer is no. You can't, but people have tried it, and it's an innovative idea. For example, everybody that turns 18, every male that turns 18, is supposed to register with the Selective Service System. If you don't register with the Selective Service System, including because of your opposition to war or your religious beliefs or secular beliefs about war, you may not be eligible for certain government loans. And there was a lawsuit that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court arguing that this restriction violated people's First Amendment rights, their rights to have an opinion, their rights to freedom of religion. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court did not see it that way, and the case was lost. But the idea that we still discriminate in the military, I do expect that President Obama will change some of the policies in the military to at least allow gay and lesbian soldiers, sailors, Marines to continue to participate in the military, even if they, when asked, do answer the question. I think he's going to change that. He hasn't done it yet, but I think he's going to change that. And I also think the military, whatever one thinks about its use, if we have a military, one of the other things that we've discovered recently is that the military in many parts of the country has really become an evangelical ministry. So that we found, we did a study of the Air Force Academy out in Colorado Springs, and we found the most extraordinary set of things happening. I mean, the football team, which is of course multi-religious, I mean it would be, this is a country, as I said, 2,000 different religions, 20 million non-believers. When the players would come into the locker room, instead of the name of the team, it said Team Jesus. Team Jesus. You will plan for Team Jesus. We had a complaint from a Mormon cadet who was always placed, he was in his 3rd year at the Air Force Academy when he wrote us. He said, they're always putting me at the lowest possible level in the dormitories to which I'm assigned. If there's a basement, I'm in the basement. If there's not a basement, I'm on the 1st floor. So I asked the commanding officer, why am I placed here? And the commander said, well, you're a Mormon, which means we're just getting you closer. We're getting you used to being in hell because you're going to end up there anyway. Can you imagine that? This is stuff that goes on. Mikey Weinstein, who some of you have seen on TV, started a whole foundation out in, he lives out in New Mexico, just to work on evangelism in the military. It's a serious problem. And here's another thing that Commander-in-Chief Obama can do, and we're going to be pushing him to do. Congressman Israel from New York State and Congresswoman Capps out in California have been very eager to get new regulations written by the Defense Department that will prohibit this kind of evangelism on your dime, that makes some of the people who choose to preserve the Constitution by being in the military to actually preserve the rights they have under the Constitution for themselves. So there is some effort being made. I think we'll see in the next year or so some movement, I hope, out of Commander-in-Chief Obama to take this bull by the horns and do something about it. But there does seem to be this tendency for people, otherwise reasonable people, and let's say they get upset because they see a nativity scene at City Hall. And they see it in December and they go, you know, there's a bunch of sheep and wise men and a baby, and that's obviously religious. The sheep are not advertising the American wool industry, right? We know what it's about. It's religious. They get upset. So instead of saying, look, we really should respect the fact that there's diversity in this community, we're going to say, put those religious displays on private property. And there's a huge amount of space. We have a chapter out in San Diego. This issue came up. They're going to put a nativity scene up at City Hall. And so our chapter members went to all the Christian churches in December and saw how many of them had a nativity scene on their lawn. 33% roughly. A third of them. The other 2/3 didn't even have it on their own property. Some of those were the same churches battling, fighting to have it put on the City Hall steps. So now the other solution is let's put up everybody's. Let's just put up everything. So then they go, and the second thing appears, a menorah. Well, that's not, for many people, an equivalent to the nativity scene, but it's something. Now, if that happens, I guarantee you that the third thing will be a sign from some of our humanist and free-thinking or atheist supporters around the country. They will put up something like, Jesus is fiction. Now you can imagine what happens. First of all, these things aren't hypotheticals. You know, I'm not one of these guys. War happens. They tear them down. People rip it down. They burn it. The season of goodwill has become the season of ill fate. All because people can't figure out that there are places and private homes and private property to display the things that matter to you, whether you're a believer or a non-believer. So this idea of putting up everybody's thing, technically the Supreme Court, I'm sad to say, kind of agrees with this. Well, if you put everything up, that's okay. They don't require it, but they kind of say that's okay. But the best answer is don't put up any of these symbols. Don't put them up. Let me summarize this. The invocation before is it the county or the city? The city council. Efforts have been made by a few of you to get rid of this. The woman up here, I'm sure she'll be happy to talk to you about it afterwards too. Maybe she said, let's start a campaign again. I'll tell you, the single best way to remove these invocations is when people don't file a lawsuit, although sometimes that works, but the better way is you create a community pressure. You bring people, including members of the Christian community, ministers, UCC ministers, Unitarian, bring them in and say, we don't need this, stop this. This makes some people feel like they don't even belong in their own city council. They feel like second-class citizens. And those arguments work. People, particularly with a change in administration, is a good time to do it. So I would heartily recommend, if you're interested in seeing this practice, stop, see the woman up here after the meeting, because this is the kind of ripe time for these kinds of efforts to succeed. I can probably do one more question. Do we have another question? Yes?
Where do we call if this occurrence happens? Who do we call? Your IRS?
Where do you, well, here's, if you see religious institutions that are breaking the law and endorsing candidates or opposing candidates using their tax-exempt money, the best thing, you can actually file a complaint with the IRS yourself, but if you write to us or call us at Americans United at au.org, you can get all the contact information. We do this enough that we know how to do it, we know who to send it to, and we can also tell you whether it's useful to do it or whether it's not reaching the level that the IRS takes interest in. The website again, what a great question. www.au, that stands for Americans United, au.org. You can find all kinds of things, videos, links to radio programs, links to TV clips, and as well as our monthly magazine. Many of you are AU members. I want to appreciate you and thank you for the support that you give, even in sometimes these very tough economic times that everybody's in. We're going to keep fighting for the Constitution. It's groups like yours that help it make it possible for us to continue and to do the work that we do. So thanks for having me down. Yes. One more question. One.
I'll put that link onto the website. Oh, good.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me again. Thank you. Thank you. Terrific. Thanks.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Have happened to me since I was here a couple of years ago. First one involves a woman named Ann Coulter. Do you know her? Yeah, Ann Coulter. What a great woman. She rewrites the same book every year, and then it always gets on the New York Times bestseller list because so many of these conservative groups buy it in bulk, thousands and thousands of copies of it, and then for the first couple weeks after it's published, she lives on cable television. In fact, she's the only author you see. You'd think nobody had written any books except perhaps Shakespeare and Ann Coulter. Anyway, upon the death of the Reverend Jerry Falwell in April of 2007, Miss Coulter wrote an obituary. And in the obituary she said, "I always agreed with Dr. Falwell, except," she said, quoting her, "there was one small item I think Falwell got wrong. He said, as you may remember, that God lifted his curtain of protection on America on September the 11th because of gay people and feminists and the ACLU. She said Dr. Falwell had gotten that wrong because he failed to specifically mention Ted Kennedy and Barry Lynn, blaming me." So that was kind of I put that in my resume now. Then during that recent president, odds enemies, he had a little spelling problem, meant enemies, and he said that what was started was a campaign of imprecatory prayer against me. Now, imprecatory prayers, for those of you who don't know, and he thought a lot of people wouldn't know, so he included in his press release a section called How to Pray Imprecatory Prayers. And they're basically prayers that call on people to die, pray for death. The one that he wanted prayed about me was the following: "Pray that my children be fatherless and my wife a widow, that my children be continually vagabonds and beg. Let them seek bread out of desolate places." Now see, that was not too kind, but he was mad, I understand that. But apparently he didn't know much about my children because he kind of got that wrong. See, my son works at Google, and my daughter is graduating from the University of Virginia Law School. She's going to work for one of the most prestigious law firms in the country starting next fall. And I think the only bread they're likely to be scavenging perhaps are baguettes in the dark corners of fancy French restaurants that you and I can't afford to go to. We'll talk plenty about what's actually going on in Washington and around the country. But just for those of you who haven't heard me before, I did election. Remember the one that went on for the last 17 years? We at Americans United do believe that if you're a church or a synagogue, a temple, you got to play by the same rules every other nonprofit does. That means you can't use your resources to endorse or oppose candidates for public office. And when we found people who did it this year, surprisingly a lot more on the right than you could imagine, we report that to the Internal Revenue Service. We say you ought to investigate this. Well, my favorite report that we did this year was for a gentleman named Wiley Drake, which I realize sounds like the name of a cartoon character, but in fact, it's a name of a Southern Baptist minister out in Orange County, California. And we had learned that he had endorsed Mike Huckabee, former governor of Arkansas, to be the nominee for the Republican Party. He did it on his church letterhead. He did it on his little radio show he does every day out of the basement of his church. We felt that this violated the prohibition against endorsing candidates with church money. So he sent a note to the IRS, and because I am a kind and wonderful person, I sent a copy of the complaint to Reverend Drake so he'd know what we had done. He didn't take too kindly to that. He immediately issued a press release, sent it out to the New York Times and to CNN, labeling me and all of my communications staff as God. Well, the good news in Washington, D.C. really is that there is, where I generally hang out, is that there really is a sea change in that city. And to put it in some kind of perspective, though, and to show you how erudite I am about matters biblical, I will say, though, sea change, yes, but it's not a parting of the Red Sea yet. And the bad guys are still coming after us from the other side. Obviously, it's better to have a president in office who has actually taught constitutional law, replacing a gentleman in office who apparently had never read the Constitution at all, which is kind of what our last president did, or didn't do. And you know, you've got to be gratified. You have to be gratified that any president would have an inaugural committee that would not only invite Pete Seeger to sing at a concert, but then allow him to sing "In This Land Is Your Land," the greatest verse of all of them, the one that you never hear. I went out walking, I saw a sign there, and the sign said private property. But on the other side, it didn't say nothing. And that side is made for you and me. That's been taken out of school books and song books for 35 years. It was kind of great to see it there. A couple things I want to give you a sense of where I thought we started on the church-state separation matter, and why in the world people want to change it, still want to change it, still want to mess with it. To me, the separation of church and state is literally the greatest intellectual idea, construct that this country has given to the rest of the world. It's the best. You know, comparatively speaking, we've had very little religious strife in this country. That doesn't mean you'd be Pollyannish about it and say nothing bad ever happened. We know that it did. My own theological antecedents now in what we call the United Church of Christ, but were frankly the people who ran the Salem witch trials back in 1692. So I know we have some problems. In Philadelphia, north of Philadelphia, right before the Civil War, churches were burned. People were murdered, literally murdered, over whether the Protestant or the Catholic version of the Bible should be read in Pennsylvania's public schools. So we haven't gotten everything right. In the Second World War, there's no question that anti-Semitism played a role in the immigration policies of the United States. And coming closer to home, September 11th, after September 11th, there were people killed just for being like Muslims. There was a man killed, for example, a gas station attendant who was a Sikh, had a Sikh headdress on, head cover.